let's talk about labels. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. So, as part of Ace Dad Advice, I get a ton of questions from people all over the world. And there are some common themes that show up again and again in the questions that I'm asked. So in this video, I thought I would tackle one area of the most common FAQs, frequent asexual questions, that I get. And it's about labels. People really struggle with labels and their asexuality. There is a lot of confusion about how you find them, there's confusion about how you use them, and there's just a lot of anxiety people have around labeling their identity when it comes to asexuality. So in this video, we're going to tackle some of the big questions under the large topic of labels, and we'll try to clear up some of the confusion out there. So let's just dive right in. How do I find my label? So this is a pretty straightforward answer. Go to the internet. So many of us have stories where the internet was the wise sage that introduced us to asexuality. And one of the really wonderful things about right now in terms of the ace community is that there is so much online information about not only asexuality in general, but also all of the micro labels and the labels and the language that we use in the community to describe our individual experiences. So a great thing to do is head over to some place like asexuality.org. That is the website for AVEN, the Asexuality Visibility and Education Network, a wonderful resource for anyone who is thinking about asexuality or coming to understand that they are ace. There are glossaries there where you can find all of the labels and explanations about them. But if you're going to go even deeper, a way to really find your label is not just to grab a glossary, but to search the internet, go onto Twitter, go on to TikTok, Instagram, and search some of the labels that you think might apply to you and see how other people are talking about them. A really useful way to understand how asexuality language is being used is to really absorb how asexual people who use those labels are talking about them. So if you find videos or you find Tumblr posts or you find essays online that have, like, say, for example, a demisexual person talking about how they experience demisexuality, you're going to get a much deeper and much better understanding of how that label is used and how that label applies to the person using it than you would if you just saw it in some glossary somewhere. There are tons of really great resources out there. Searching the hashtags on TikTok, searching the hashtags here on YouTube, searching hashtags on Instagram and Twitter will help you find people who are talking about labels and talking about how they use the labels. And that's going to give you a deeper picture about how to find your own. It's also important to remember here when you are looking at this stuff is to try to zero in on the things that instinctively feel right to you. Don't get bogged down in the massive amount of information on the internet surrounding labels. Read definitions, see if there are labels that strike that little chord of recognition in you, the labels that just make that, where you have that little click and you go, oh yeah, that feels like it might be me. And zero in there. You don't have to get obsessive and research every single label to make sure you have found the right one. Find language that you resonate with. Find language that speaks to you and of you, and focus your attention there. That's going to be the most handy and most efficient way to really find language that works for you. Can I use a label if... So I get a ton of questions just like this. Can I use a label if I have this one experience that doesn't quite line up? Can I use a label if it doesn't quite exactly match? Can I use a label if I don't fully understand? Lots of qualifiers around labels with people. There's a ton of anxiety that people have when they are approaching attaching a word to their experience. of making sure that that word is the right word. But it's often framed to me in a unique and maybe not necessarily helpful way. Often the people who are kind of having this anxiety are worried that they don't fit the word. They're worried that they are using a word that doesn't fit or doesn't belong to them, or they're using the wrong word to describe their experience. They think about their relationship to a label as a relationship in which they could potentially be doing something wrong. And that is not how all of this works. I say this all the time. Labels are tools, not tests. Labels exist to help us describe our experience to ourselves and to the people around us. And they also exist to help us find community with other people who share our experience. That's it. We don't have to fit ourselves to some benchmarks and a to-do list under each label in order to use that bit of language. The language exists to help us. The language exists to illuminate us and our experience. It exists to help us. So if we are drawn to a bit of language that maybe, doesn't quite fit exactly, or fits most of the time, or right now feels like the right thing for us, we can use it. We are not bound to shove ourselves into the boxes of labels. Labels exist to serve us. It's important to remember here that human sexuality, human experience all across the board is incredibly complicated and nuanced and contains many variations and many different layers. It is impossible for any bit of language, no matter how micro that micro label gets, it's never going to really capture every single thing about a human experience. And every person's individual, unique experience isn't going to have some perfect word that describes it absolutely and identically out there. Because language is imprecise, no matter how precise we try to make it, it's important for us to think about these identity labels and to think about this language as, getting most of the way there. It describes, as I've said this in other situations, this language describes patterns of our experience. It describes broad strokes of our experience, the overall thing that happens maybe most of the time. That's about as close as we can reasonably expect to get with labels. So hang on to that. Don't get too precious about fitting it exactly, and don't freak out if you can't find the word that absolutely specifically defines your experience. Find the thing that comes close. Find the thing that works for you. Find the thing that makes you feel good. And use that language until you need something else. Can I use more than one label? So this goes back to that idea that labels are tools, not tests. If you're building a house, you're going to need more than a hammer, right? You're going to need a lot of tools maybe to build that house. But if you're, say, if you're like constructing like a small sculpture in your house, maybe you don't need as many tools. You use the number of tools necessary to do the thing you need to do. And the same thing applies with identity language. We use the number of labels that we need to in order to describe our experience and to communicate our experience. And that distinction is really important here. Labels aren't just to help us understand an experience, but it's to communicate them. And so if more than one label helps you communicate better your experience to other people, use more than one label. You can be ace and something else. You can be gay and ace, bi and ace. You can use multiple labels to talk about how you experience romantic attraction, sexual attraction, how you relate to sexual activity. Put together the number of tools that accurately do the job of communicating you to other people and to the world. You're not bound to only use one word forever and ever. You can use as many as you need. You can use as few as you need. You can use none if that works better for you. The focus is always what works for you, what helps you. You're the focus, you're the center, not the words. Do I even need labels? I think whenever we first come out as ace people, we are thrown into this world of many labels, many micro labels, many qualifiers. It can be kind of really overwhelming. And we can feel a lot of pressure to find the words in that big grimoire of asexuality language that will, help us find who we are. We can feel pressure to choose labels. But we don't always have to use labels. We don't need them if they don't work for us. It's perfectly okay if you understand your experience but don't necessarily feel a need to communicate it using a variety of micro labels or identity markers or other language like that. If for you just the experience of something is enough, then that is enough and you don't need those labels. Maybe you just need one. Personally, that is kind of how I relate a lot to identity language. There are certainly a bunch of asexual micro labels that describe my experience, but I just don't necessarily feel compelled to use them to describe myself. I feel completely comfortable using queer and asexual to describe me. Those are the only two words I need. And while there are a plethora of other words that describe how I move through the world, like homoromantic, gay can work too, probably phrase sexual is a bit of asexuality language that works for me. While those words may work, I don't necessarily use them or feel the need to use them. So I don't. Just because a label fits you and a label describes you, it doesn't mean that you have to use them. You use just what you need. Pick up what is useful, discard what isn't. Pick up what resonates, discard what doesn't. Do what works for you. That's what the language is for. As always, thank you so much for supporting the channel. I hope this conversation about labels was useful to you. If you have more specific questions and want to see them answered on my Ace Dad Advice column, you could head over to my website, acedadadvice.com, and submit your questions there. I try to get to them as quickly as I can and answer them. I'm happy to answer your specific question, whether it be about labels, asexuality in general, sex, love, relationships, whatever. I'm happy to answer them there. And I want to remind you that if you really like what's happening here, you can become a patron on Patreon. If you head over to patreon.com/acedadadvice, you can, for a couple of bucks a month, get some extra bonus content, including downloadable stuff like workbooks and other downloadable things. You can get a podcast, you can get additional video stuff, and also a monthly live event that I do where I hang out with folks online for a little while and answer some questions. So patreon.com/acedadadvice. Thank you for all your support, and I'll see you in the next video.